who is going to talk to us about nanotechnology. Roger Bonnecaze is the co-director of the Nano Manufacturing Systems for Mobile Computing and the Mobile Energy Technology Center. The center develops high throughput, high yield and versatile nano manufacturing systems to take nanoscience discoveries from the lab to the marketplace, which I think is a very interesting point to explore, is what happens when technologies hit culture. So I will hand the reins over to Roger. Welcome.
So when I became a professor 21 years ago, my dream was that I would have lunch with faculty in philosophy and art and economics. And JD, I want to thank you that after 21 years, that dream has finally come true. So I'm going to talk about something absolutely, completely different. But I'm going to try to maybe make some connections, I think, with what we've talked about, heard talked about earlier. So the center that I'm part of, it's led out of the University of Texas. It involves also some faculty at Berkeley and University of New Mexico. We have some foreign partners in India and Korea. But the center's focus is really to develop tools and materials for nanofabrication. And I think we can think of this as really, we want to create our paintbrushes and paints to make the things that we want for making nano-enabled devices. And to be a little concrete, I want to talk about something that we all sort of experience every day, and this is essentially a polarizer on our smartphones, okay? So essentially the way the light is basically guided and moved to create that nice sharp image on your iPhone or your Samsung or your iPad, etc., is a polarizer. And the polarizer essentially orients the way the light is flowing in a special way. But it turns out that with the current way we polarize light on our iPhones, it's done in a rather inefficient way. A lot of the light is absorbed and we don't actually see it with our eyes. And so we need a really large backlight to see it. And so what we would like is a way to really just turn the light around and use it all, and not to have such a big backlight, because if you have a smaller backlight, your battery runs longer, you'll have a sharper image, etc. And so the way this can be done with nanophotonics is by creating aluminum lines that are essentially 50 nanometers wide and basically with a spacing of about 50 nanometers. And it turns out that this helps orient the light, and the so-called wire grid polarizer is much brighter, is much more energy efficient. You can actually have a much thinner phone and display, and it actually leads to a much cheaper phone. So it's great all the way around. The challenge, though, is that you need to make this tens of nanometer aluminum lines over length scales that are inches, right, the size of your phone or your iPad, and you need to do it with a fair amount of precision for this to work. So you have very small objects that you want to order over very, very large distances. And I'm going to keep this, essentially, the stuff I'll talk about is going to be a three-dimensional, really even a two-dimensional problem. I'm not even going to touch 11 dimensions because it's hard enough for us to do this on surfaces. Okay, so this is sort of the backdrop of doing this. And really right now, there is no cost-effective technology to make these aluminum lines. Right? We understand the physics to do it, but we don't know how to make it in large scale and at the right cost. So what our center is really focused on is bridging a gap. And that gap is, there are these societal wants and needs, right? We want better mobile devices, better electronic displays. We want to wear these flexible electronics. We want to have solar, photovoltaic energy capturing devices sort of put into our clothing, into our cars, so that we can get all the power we want. We want to have ubiquitous sensors or cheap sensors so that we can monitor our health. We want to have neuromorphic electronics where, well, maybe not all of us want to have it, but where you can essentially, connect it's sort of the brain-machine interface. So you can start making a telephone call just by having your mind decide that that's the time to do it. And we can have a discussion about whether these really are desirable and stuff, but there are certainly these wants and needs. And there is plenty of nanoscience to make this happen. So, if you listen to NPR or you watch Nova, every week, there's always these discoveries that are absolutely amazing. But it's very hard to take something that's done in a lab, usually at a very small length scale. Maybe they did it on a square millimeter and they show this really great microscopic photograph, and actually take that and scale it up to the size of your display on your phone, for instance, or the size of a television, just as an example, or the size of an airplane wing if you want to put flexible solar panels on it. How do you do that? And so, we have all these technologies, on the left-hand side, but we need to actually have a manufacturing solution to make this happen, okay? And so, a manufacturing solution is something that's scalable. You can take what you did in the lab and do it at larger scale, like in that facility where Margot was getting the metal boxes made. Okay, you also need to have it cost effective. The market will only bear so much, and then there's these other issues you have to solve. You have to have these actual processing systems, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But you can think of these as the tools to create these nanoscale objects. You also need to have the process, and you can think of that as the technique, okay, to make the device. We do have our critics, and it's basically we have to hit certain specifications to make sure the device works, and so we have to have some way of measuring that, and we call that metrology. And then finally, we need to have modeling and to understand what goes on. And this is in some sense, in analogy to the CAD that we saw that Margot did to help design her structure. We need to do that in advance to make sure that what we think will work before we go off and spend millions or tens of millions or $1 billion building a facility to make this so. So what we're trying to do at the center is make essentially these nano factories, okay? And so to make a nano factory, you have to have several components all working together. And I'm going to focus in this talk just on making roll-to-roll nano factories. So we want to do things on sheets, okay? And so the attractiveness of doing it on sheets is that when you do it in this continuous sheet process, it's much less expensive. It also allows you to make things that are flexible and bendable and wearable, which is very attractive. And so, what are the things that we have to do? Well, we need to be able to put structures on the surface with certain shapes and sizes, and that requires nanoshape imprint and perhaps etching, and then also depositing metals. We also need to coat the surfaces to encapsulate them and protect them, and so that could be this nanoscale encapsulation. We oftentimes want to exfoliate or apply materials with interesting electronic or thermal properties, and so graphene transfers, one of the things we want to do is we want to peel an atomically thin layer of graphene that's grown on copper, peel it off of that and put it completely intact onto a flexible polymer substrate that you could make some interesting flexible device with. And I can give you an example in a minute. And of course, we want to do controlled nanomaterials deposition. Earlier when I got here, I was looking at Margot's work in there, and I was looking at those really nice pictures, and she showed those small balls all organized. And a large part of what my career in the last 5 or 10 years has been arranging nanoparticles on surfaces. And I want to put them any way I want, and I actually want to get rid of those little fissures and breaks and things like that. It's taken me a long time to actually figure out how to do that. It turns out it's not so easy because I have to deal with these other objects that are there for various practical purposes. And then finally, to have a factory, you have to analyze to know that you're making what you're knowing, and that's this metrology. And the idea is you can make mobile devices, flexible watches that maybe also gather their own power, maybe from the heat of your own body or from the ambient radiation, and maybe flexible phones that you can stick in your back pocket or bend or fold up, etc. And the center is focused on, we're trying to build the tools and the materials But in order to have focus, you have to have a device in mind. And so we're trying to make mobile devices. But the things that we're making, we can imagine being used for healthcare monitoring, for solar panels, for security devices, and all sorts of other things. Okay, so we want to make these new tools and the materials to create. So as I mentioned, one of the things we're trying to do is making a roll-to-roll dry transfer of graphene. So this is this atomic layer peeling problem, where we want to grow graphene on these copper foils, okay, that are, hundreds of millimeters wide, okay, and tens of meters long, and then they're grown on this, and then you want to peel this entire structure that's 1 atom thick, intact, and put it onto a flexible polymer. Oh, and I want to do this at roughly 30 centimeters a minute. Okay, so it's high speed. So we've been able to do it at about a centimeter a minute, and we've been able to do it over about a foot. So we're getting there, but there's a long way to go. And so we want to make it so we can have graphene, which is this beautiful hexagonal structure. And so the nodes are essentially carbon atoms, and what I don't show are the hydrogen atoms that stick up. And because of this ordered pattern, it has these remarkable electronic properties that are valuable for making various devices. The other reason why it'd be nice to make large amounts of this is that you could use it to make these exquisite separation membranes, because once you have the graphene, you can start cutting holes into it. And you can engineer the size of the holes and even maybe chemically decorate the edge of the holes to have other molecules, so that you can do separations between, say, oxygen and nitrogen in the atmosphere. So oxygen molecules and nitrogen molecules are very, very close in size. Okay? But with the graphene, if you punch the holes just right, you can produce this exquisite separation with very high selectivity, so you're only separating out, say, the nitrogen, and at very low cost. And this is useful for all sorts of things. One example would be just to produce oxygen in a hospital for a patient, but there's an entire industry of industrial gases where you have to make oxygen, and it requires an enormous amount of energy that is basically produced by burning fossil fuels. And if you could put this technique, you could make a significant impact in reducing energy consumption and reducing greenhouse gases, et cetera. So this is one example. Another one is patterning technology. So we want to basically put in these interesting structures on surfaces. And so this is one example. These are micro lenses. And what you want to do is you want to actually put these over light-emitting diodes. Okay? And what they do is they greatly enhance the efficiency that light's emitted. So again, it's an energy-saving structure. And what's interesting is that this is not really a periodic structure that you see up there with these small micro lenses. It's actually, it's mathematically describable, but totally aperiodic. And the structure has been one that's been determined mathematically that optimizes the flow of light from the light-emitting diode outwards to us, essentially. Okay, so how do you actually to make such a nano imprint structure like that? And so a couple of my colleagues at the University of Texas developed something called jet and flash imprint lithography, which, as you'll see, is essentially a mechanical printing process. Okay, except now we're going to take it to a nanometer length scales. And just to put context on what I mean by nanometer length scales, your hair, a thick hair is roughly 100 microns in diameter. And so that's about 100,000 nanometers across. So we're talking about things that are 100 thousandths of a nanometer. And so the way this technique works is you have some substrate and you have a stamp, a template that's transparent, and that's important for the process. And what you do is you squirt down a photocurable liquid, okay? And what I mean by that, and then what I do is I squish the template down on the surface. And when I squish the template down, it fills the pattern, and then I shine light, and this material polymerizes and forms a solid. And then I can peel off the template, and I can repeat this process, which I have to do here. And so you can basically make this nice regular pattern on the surface, for example, to make that wire grid polarizer. And so we basically developed a machine that does this on about 100 millimeter scale, and we can do this at about a meter a minute, which is competitive, in an industrial environment. And so we can make these very controlled patterns once we have the template. And really this harkens back to a very old way of patterning surfaces. And we're just doing it in this mechanical way at a very small length scale. And there's definitely challenges associated with making the template that I'd be happy to talk about if you're interested. But our goal is to make what we like to call nano-sculpted surfaces, right? So this really is a combination of the imprinting and then doing etching steps with chemicals. And you can make things like nanopyramids like this. And so here, again, it's a photonic application. So if you have this on the back of a solar collector, this enhances the amount of light you absorb and makes them more efficient. Turns out if you package drugs in objects that have certain shapes, like triangles or pentagons, they actually do a better job in terms of drug delivery. And so being able to sculpt these objects at a large scale opens all sorts of possibilities in terms of drug delivery. And one of the other things we're doing at the center is we're working on making stars and diamond-shaped structures. And so here I show a scanning electron microscope image of a diamond that we've made of magnetic materials. And the reason we want to have shape is because we can store more than 1 bit of information in the magnetic element. And so, right now in your phones or your computers at home, each magnetic element only stores 1 bit. Well, this one can store 2 or 3 bits, so you get more memory per area, so you can make your device smaller. We can make our devices thinner, so you can make them flexible. And the best thing of all, these things use a lot less power, and so your phone runs longer between charges. So it's advantageous. Okay, so we're using these tools, and these processes, if you like, right? So, they're what's in our artistic bag, if you like, to make mobile devices. But you can certainly imagine that these tools could someday be used, for nanofabrication for art. And there's already hints of this happening in things like nanophotonic fabrics that, are flexible and they can change color and glow, and you can do some, pretty amazing things with them. And at this point, they've tested it out on fabrics because I think this is something where, there's a market for it, and so you can afford to sort of use the machines to do that. But just to draw an analogy, I mean, what's happened now is that you see this sort of 3D printing where you have these machines that essentially deposit in a very methodical way material and solidify. You can make all sorts of beautiful objects like this helix here, and this is some spectacular object here that they made with the 3D printer that I don't know how you can make it any other way, that I personally find attractive. And so they're really doing this regularly now with 3D printers that cost thousands of dollars. I can remember 15 years ago visiting a company making 3D printers. They were $100,000, $200,000, and the only companies that would buy them are automobile makers, jet engine manufacturers, airplane manufacturers, because they would buy them to build prototypes to make sure everything fit in the right place. And they could afford to spend that amount of money. But after 15 or 20 years, the technology developed that the prices is now that it's accessible to the general community. And I think that a lot of these nano manufacturing processes, we're at the early stage, but then in 15 or 20 years, these tools will be regularly available so that people can create things that I and everybody in this room probably haven't even imagined yet. So.